Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo developer evangelist. I'm here to talk about iOS projects and give you an overview of what that involves. So let's talk a bit about iOS apps. Xojo's been able to make iOS apps since 2014. And we think this is probably the easiest way you can make iOS apps because Xojo is pretty easy and approachable tool for a lot of people. And Xojo makes actual native 64-bit apps. And these apps are fully App Store compliant. They're not, there's no wrapper around them or anything like that. They're actual native 64-bit binary apps. And you get a variety of ways you can run these apps, deploy these apps, get them out there. For most of your testing, while you're working in Xojo, you're going to use the iOS simulator. And this lets you just kind of hit run right in the IDE, and your app shows up, and you can test it out right there using the debugger. It's fast and easy. You can also deploy your apps. You can build them to install them on a device. And you will want to test on real devices because a real device can do things that the simulator can't. If you're using any of the motion features or things like that, the simulator doesn't really have a way to simulate that. So you want to put it on a device. And of course, real hardware is always different than the simulator. But perhaps the biggest difference is actually the CPU. When you run in the iOS simulator, you're technically running your app as an x86 build because that's what Macs use for CPUs, at least currently. But when you build for a device, you're building it for ARM. So that means it's compiled differently. So, there's always a possibility that there could be some subtle changes there. So it's a good reason to make sure you test on devices. You can also deploy to Apple's test flight system for beta testing. This allows you to more easily distribute your apps to a wider group to get it tested on actual devices. And then, of course, the end game is to get your app into the actual App Store so that people can find it, download it, and use it. And another option that's not used as commonly is enterprise deployments. And we do have a few customers that do have Xojo-made apps that are deployed in this manner. This is more of a manual process to set up. It's not something Xojo has built in for an automatic enterprise deployment, but you can build your apps and tweak a few things in there and then be able to distribute it using Apple's enterprise tools. And in order to make iOS apps using Xojo, you are unfortunately going to have to install Xcode. You're not really going to have to use it, which is good, but you do have to install it. That means you have to download it. It's a pretty big download. But you'll have to install it. And that's because there's a few tools that are embedded in Xcode that anyone needs in order to be able to make iOS apps. And in particular, profiles, which we'll talk about in a minute, that you need to create and download and install. That's managed by Xcode. The iOS simulator itself is part of the Xcode package, and that's pretty important to have. And there's also another tool called App Loader that is used for submitting your app up to iTunes, I guess it's called App Connect now, so that you can use it with TestFlight or the App Store. And that's also built into Xcode. So on the Xojo side, let's talk a bit about project items. There are several general project items that are available in all Xojo project types. And these are class interface, folder, image, and module. And these are what you would use to, generally organize your project, design it. Obviously, you use classes for a large chunk of your code, along with class interfaces. And folders are used to organize things, as modules can also be, in addition to modules containing code. And then images are technically image sets that allow you to have images for multiple sizes so that they can scale appropriately depending on the pixel density of the display being used. And as you may be aware, iPhones and iOS devices have lots of different pixel density sizes. There's also several iOS specific project items. You have, of course, the app that's automatically added to all projects right when you create a new blank iOS project. There's also container controls, and a subclass of that is the custom table cell. Launch screen is another project item that allows you to essentially have a splash screen that will appear while your app is loading and setting up. And then view is the primary area where you'll design your user interface and whatnot. And then screen is the last item that's iOS specific that allows you to control how the screen looks overall. So speaking of that, let's talk a bit about screen versus view. So screens, they're not for designing the layout. You're not going to drag and drop things onto a screen. You're not really going to do much with a screen, really. Therefore, indicating how the screen actually looks. So in its simplest form, a screen is going to just show a view. And that would be the simplest form. So a single view is just displayed on the screen. But you can also set up tabs so that you can have little tab-ish buttons on the bottom. And as you tap each one, essentially a different view is displayed. So in that case, your screen type would be tabs. And then on iPad, you can also set up a screen type of split. And this allows you to have a view on the left-hand side and a view on the right-hand side. Kind of something you might see if you, say, used Mail in landscape on an iPad. Also on the screens, you can indicate which orientations your app supports or you want to allow it to do. So in particular, not a lot of iPhone apps seem to support a lot of orientations. They often just have standard portrait with the home button on the bottom. But you can allow landscape modes with the home button on the left or the right, and you can even allow a mode where the phone is essentially flipped upside down. And if those modes are all turned on, your UI will just kind of spin around and display appropriately. Now, views are where you probably spend most of your time when you're working on your user interface, because that is where you're going to design your layout using controls, dragging things over from the library, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, the views are actually used by the screens. So you'll select a view in the screen depending on how you want your screen to be shown. Now, a little bit about iOS app icons. There's a lot of them. And there's a lot of different sizes. And it's kind of a pain to make them all. So we include with Xojo a little utility called iOS Image Maker. And this generates app icons in all the sizes that are required. So essentially, you just pick one image, set a background color if you want. And then you're going to generally want all these sizes. So you have them all selected and you click Create Icons, and it's going to create a folder for you and scale the image appropriately. So you'll have a bunch of those image files in the folder, and then you can use them in your project. You can find this utility in the Xojo installation. It's in the Extras folder, and then there's an iOS Utilities folder. It's in there. And then once you have your folder of icons, you can just drag them into the app icon slots when you select the app icon in the navigator. Let's go over a few of the settings that are available for iOS apps. On the app is where you're going to set the default screens. So essentially, which of the screens that you've set up is what is displayed by default when your app is run on an iPhone, and which is displayed by default when your app is run on an iPad. And you can also you set those to none, essentially. So for example, if you want to make an app that doesn't run on an iPhone, you can set the default iPhone screen to none, and then your app will be iPad only. Now, you can't technically make an iPhone only app because the iPad can run any iPhone app and it'll just scale it. So you can design an app that doesn't have a dedicated iPad screen, and then it'll just use your iPhone screen and layouts and scale them up as the operating system does. Shared build settings is where version information is stored and build information, including the optimization setting for the compiler. Most people just leave that as at default, but if you're doing anything with serious calculations, you can crank that up. There's also debug settings. And then the iOS build settings has several things you can tweak in there. Of course, you get the app name and the bundle identifier. And these are pretty important. The bundle identifier we'll talk about in a minute. It's also called the app ID, and that has to match stuff you set up on Apple's side when you're creating all the things you need in order for these things to be approved in the App Store. And when you are building for devices or to upload to Apple, you do have to code sign your apps, and that involves some other steps, which I'll talk about next. And then when you're debugging and running and testing and all that good stuff, you can choose which device the iOS simulator starts up in. And the selection of devices you'll have will be based on, the version of Xcode you're running and what it makes available. But, for example, you can pick, iPhone 8, iPhone 8 Plus, iPhone 10s, the newer 10 models, 10s, 10R. And you can run your app in the simulator when it's simulating those types of devices. And that's a nice handy way just to get a feel for how things are going to look on a variety of devices without you having to own all of them. And you can just switch that setting here in the iOS build settings. All right, let's talk a bit about deployment. So deploying to the device is probably going to be your first step. And that can be, any device you happen to have access to. And I'm not going to go into super specifics on how you set all this up. We have pages in the documentation that describe the steps. There are a fair amount of steps to do this, and nothing is super complicated. There's just a lot of steps, so it can be a little tedious, but these are Apple's rules, not ours, unfortunately, so that's what's required. So you do have to go to developer.apple.com. You actually have to have a developer membership with them, which is $99 a year in order to set all this up. And then you go to the certificates, identifiers, and profiles section of that website area. And then you can create your certificates. So when you're deploying to a device, you need the iOS development certificate. And then you need to create an app ID for the app you're working on. So that also matches up with the bundle identifier. So that's the reverse domain thing. So it would be like com.xojo.feedback would be a app ID for a version of feedback that was going to iOS, for example. And then you need to create a provisioning profile, which is kind of a combination of the certificate and the ID. And that needs to actually also end up being installed on the device, in addition to your Mac. So with all those things in place, you are able to do a build that is code signed for your devices. Also in here is the step where you actually have to add your devices. So you'll need to get the IDs of the devices and add them in there as well so that information is included in the provisioning profile. And like I said, nothing super complicated, but there's a lot of steps and it can be a little tedious. But you only have to do these things once per app. You don't have to do it every time. When you're deploying to TestFlight or the App Store, it's pretty similar. It's just you need different things. So instead of the development certificate, you need the distribution certificate. You'd still use the same app ID that you created. but instead of a development provisioning profile, you need a distribution provisioning profile. And that doesn't have to include devices, of course, because it's going to be uploaded and will work on any device. But on a high level, the processes are very similar. All right, let's switch over to Xojo here and just take a look at an iOS project and what that has in here. So we'll just create a blank one here. So you can see Xojo starting with a blank project gives you the designer for the default view. And if we go through the various areas, you can see, click on the app, you got your selections here for the screens. There's also an iPhone screen and an iPad screen that show up by default. And you can see it has selected here by default. The iPhone screen is just showing whatever happens to be in view 1. So you can see it kind of gives you a preview here. You can't do anything here. I can't click on that button or anything like that. I could change it to tabs if I wanted. And then if I had multiple views, I could adjust them. I can click on the tabs to select what view shows in each tab. And there's also a little preview window up here, and you can switch to landscape or portrait. And again, this is all just for preview purposes. It doesn't control how your app operates in any way. So those are the screens. The view, you know, if you've worked with desktop or web projects, this is largely equivalent to the window or the web page. And as I did before, this is where you drag your controls around, move things, do the layout. iOS uses auto layout for the positioning of controls. So you can see here, you have this section here for auto layout. And there's rules that are on here. So for height and left and right. And the cool thing is it allows you to set positioning based on other controls. So if I come here and put this button, here you can see that it's saying the left position of this button is the right position of this label plus a small gap. So that's the standard offset or standard gap. And you can't do that easily in web or desktop projects because they do not have auto layout. So this allows you to create UIs that flow a bit more nicely, particularly that is useful with lots of the various iPhone and iPad screen sizes. But also just gives you some flexibility. You know, if I had a column of buttons here and they're all controlled to be related to each other, I could probably tweak one, say one label's width, and the button would automatically move over. I wouldn't have to go through and reposition everything and do all that stuff. It would automatically know, you know, if I make this button wider, it knows to shove, make this label wider, it knows to shove the button over because it's always hitched to the right side of the label. And there are also preview options here. Should you want to see how your layout might look on different screen sizes. And depending on what you're trying to support, it's often good to design with the smaller screen, make sure everything fits, and then check how it looks on the bigger screens. But sometimes you may not want to support a smaller screen because it's not a lot of space. All right, the app icon I mentioned before, this is what the iOS Image Maker utility tool generates for you, is all these icons that go in these slots. So after you get your folder of icons generated by the tool, you can just drag them over from the Finder and drop them into the appropriate slot. And that'll allow you to build your app. You could certainly build it without all the icons, but you can't. If you just submit it to the App Store without all the proper icons in place, you'll get back an error and your app will be rejected until you fix it. So you want to make sure you have all those in place. It does seem like some of these are needlessly small. 20 by 20 at 1x is a very small icon size. Not even sure if any phone cares about something that tiny these days, but there it is. And the launch screen, this is totally optional. Most apps are probably going to leave this alone, not really do anything with it, because the app will start up fast enough that you don't really need a splash screen of any sort, as your first screen and view will just immediately display. But if you did want something special up here, you can tweak the background color so that shows up. And then you can use a couple of the controls that are static. So in particular, a label. You can put a label on here, and then you can put the image well on here to have your own logo or something like that. You can't have anything interactive on here, so no buttons or anything that actually a user would interact with. But it does give you the ability to have your app have that little startup splash, which for some apps, if they do a lot of initialization stuff that might make them sit at a white screen for longer than you'd want, the launch screen can be helpful. The shared build settings here has all the usual version information. And the optimization level here, you get default, moderate, and aggressive. And again, going off of default probably isn't necessary unless your app does some serious calculations. And then iOS settings here. I mentioned the name and the bundle identifier. When I've built apps, one thing I've noticed is the two need to match up pretty closely. Haven't found an actual specific rule on Apple's site, but for example, if you're just doing testing and you have a generic bundle identifier called test app or something like that, and you're like, oh, I'm just going to use that to test an app with a different name, like say iOS project. If you tried to code sign that using your test app certificates, it doesn't always work. Sometimes I need to go to the app name and add test or some other phrase or some other part of the bundle identifier in the app name. So apparently Apple is trying to enforce some relationship between these two, but it doesn't seem to match 100%. It's not like this had to be exactly the same as the app name. So I haven't figured out a pattern or found anything official stated by Apple on that, but something to keep in mind when you're working on these things. When you have all the certificates installed and you click the team here, you'll get a drop-down list of the essentially what code signing options are available to you. And unless you have a bunch of iTunes accounts and are building apps and for a variety of different accounts, you're probably only going to have one. In my case, on my main Mac account, where I have everything installed instead of this account, I have two settings, one for my company and one for Xojo, and I can choose between the two. And then when you are building for the App Store, you can flip the switch here to tell Xojo to build for the App Store. When it's off, it's just doing a build that you can transfer over to the device manually. And the difference is just in packaging, really. And then here you can choose which iOS simulator you want to start and test your app in. And you can see on my version of Xcode, which is, I believe I still have Xcode 9 on this computer. So you can see I only have up to an iPhone 10. I don't have the newer 10S or 10R simulators installed here. I would need to upgrade to Xcode 10 to get those. But I've also got various operating system versions available to me as well, which is handy. So right now it would default to this one here, the iPhone 5S running 10.3. And that's all good for testing, as you can just switch between them as needed. So if you want to, and when you want to run anything, you just tap the run button, or click it in this case. And it's going to do a standard build like it normally would for anything else. And then it kicks off the simulator. And you have to wait for the simulator to boot. So what some people do is not quit the simulator after, in between debugging sessions, which is super easy to do, and I often will find myself do it anyway. So you can see here, this is the simulator is running. Our app with its simple button and label showed up here. And if you were done, you could just hit or click Quit Simulator, and that'll take you back to Xojo, just as if you quit a Mac app or something. And you can go back to editing your code. But the next time you run, you have to wait for the simulator to boot back up. So if you want to avoid that boot, you can just go to the debugger and press stop. And you can see that killed the app in the simulator. It left it installed out here, but it killed it. So the next time I run, I don't have to wait for the full simulator boot. I just have to wait for the app to be transferred over and then launched. So a much shorter debug cycle time there. But even though I know that is much faster, I still often find myself with the simulator here, clicking Command Q and quitting it. And that auto jumps back here in Xojo to where you last were working. So yeah, I haven't gotten used to that little optimization myself, but I like to point it out to people. All right, so that's on a high level, the overall parts of an iOS project and how a few things work together. And I want to just call out some of the newer features that have been added to iOS projects. You can, of course, get the full list of things as they're changed on the doc site on this page here. And most recently, in 2018 R3, the only big change for iOS is that we updated the SDK. So we're now using the iOS 12 SDK with 2018 R3. And the iOS 12 SDK is the SDK with Xcode 10. That's the one that provides support for the 10S and the 10R. And that's great. That's in 2018 R3. And the 12.1 SDK was just released, and that added support for the new iPad Pros that came out a few weeks ago. And that's on the way. We're working on that now. That will be available in the next release of Xojo. So trying to get these SDKs out to you as quickly as possible so that you'll be able to support the latest Apple devices. In 2018 R2, we added a few new iOS features, including pull to refresh on tables. So you can just kind of drag a table down and you get a little spinner, and that calls an event where you can reload your data. You can have variable height rows in a iOS table. Again, handy for lots of UI designs. In iOS tables, as you're adding and removing rows, the row that is now animated, so you kind of see the row pop in or pop out as opposed to just immediately appear. Small tweak, but users like that sort of thing. And then also, you have the option to turn on large titles in your views for when your app is running on iOS 11 or later. And again, those look nice, particularly on the newer iPhone 10 size devices. You get a giant title at the top. And 2016 R2 added a whole bunch of stuff to iOS projects. If you haven't looked at it recently, just rattle a few of them off here because there's way too many to go into in great detail. But that's when launch screens were first added. Tables had a lot of enhancements, including row editing, ordering, and the ability to have custom cells for all kinds of fancy UI layouts. The motion controller was added, so you can track the motion of your device. The location control allows you to request the device location. And Picture Picker lets you select pictures from the user's photo library or take them with the camera. Scrollable area is a great control that allows you to essentially create a layout that's larger than the device screen itself, and they can just keep scrolling to get to more controls. And the sharing panel pops up a little panel that allows you to send picture, text, or URL to another app that's on the device. And an IDE tweak that was made is that toolbars, which previously had to be created using just source code, can now be created in the layout editor itself, which is nice. All right, as we're going to wrap up here, I want to remind everyone that the Xojo Developer Conference 2019 is coming up in 2019. Next year, it is May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in Miami, Florida. You can go to xojo.com/XDC to find out more, including getting the session schedule, which should be appearing soon-ish. We got a great deal on rooms there. Miami, from what I'm told, is a very beautiful, warm place. And at relatively low price, $149 rooms, you might want to stay before or after the conference and check things out. And a reminder that November is the last month to get discounted XDC tickets. And this is the last week of November. So if you're interested, do be sure to check out the site. So a few helpful resources for you. As always, head to xojo.com/download to grab the latest version of Xojo, which comes out approximately quarterly. So you always want to head over there and make sure you're running, or at least check out the new version, read the release notes, see what's new, see which projects make sense for you to update. Head to youtube.com/GoXojo. That's our YouTube channel where all our videos are posted, including these. You can subscribe there and you'll get a notification whenever new videos appear. Xojo.com/learn is where you can get our free Introduction to Programming book. It's a great place to start if you're new to coding or just getting back into it after having not done it for a while, or even if you just want to ease into Xojo easily. That is a great book to start with. The Xojo forum is our user community, forum.xojo.com. Head over there to ask or answer questions. Great place to search and get answers to questions. Check it out, friendly place. And here's a few links to where you can find more information. Head to docs.xojo.com. You can go to the iOS category to see a complete list of all topics related to iOS. And then our user guide topics are at developer.xojo.com, and we've got a topic on iOS apps and one on all the iOS user interface components and controls. As always, if you have questions, you can reach me. I'm at email, paul@xojo.com, or at Twitter, @Lefevre, and the official Xojo Twitter account is @Xojo. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.